I thought my past was behind me, until a single gunshot shattered everything. Now, the woman who betrayed me is fighting for her life, the woman I love is waiting for an answer, and I'm caught between the past and the future, with no way to escape. I've driven down Hooch Road more times than I can count, but somehow I'd never noticed the small white farmhouse on the right. It stood just off an old highway winding through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. This road had a history. Different sections like the Chickasaw Turnpike had their own stories to tell. But to my grandfather, it was always just Hooch Road, a twisting dirt path cutting through the Carolina mountains. It played a quiet but important role in the early days of NASCAR, thanks to the moonshine runners who perfected their driving skills on its sharp turns. The house itself was well kept, its fresh white paint standing out against the backdrop of thick forest. A sturdy wooden fence enclosed a pasture on one side, built from solid planks and timber. It had that simple, timeless charm that mountain homes tend to carry. I might have driven right past it again, lost in thought, if not for the sudden burst of steam from under my truck's hood. A radiator hose had given out, and I knew I wouldn't get much farther without fixing it. I pulled into a gravel lot nearby, parking halfway to the farmhouse. I stepped out and knocked on the wooden door. "Hello? Anyone home?" Mountain folks could be cautious around strangers, but once they warmed up to you, they were some of the kindest people you'd ever meet. Still, I kept my distance, staying on the porch just in case. After a few moments, I noticed movement behind a window above. A shadowy face appeared, though the features weren't clear. Then a woman's voice called out. "Who are you and what do you need?" "Joshua Sutton from Wayville," I answered. "I was hoping to fix my truck and get some water. I patched up a burst radiator hose a few miles back, but it's not holding." The woman hesitated for a moment before responding. "Wait there." Then she disappeared from view. While I stood there, I took in my surroundings. Everything was surprisingly well maintained. The porch freshly painted, the garden lush and tidy, and even the nets on the windows were in perfect shape. Whoever lived here took pride in their home. As I approached the door, I was met by two large German shepherds, standing silent but watchful beside their owner. Their presence was enough to make me stop in my tracks. "Behave yourself and they won't bother you," the woman assured me as she opened the door. Then, with a simple gesture, she invited me inside. "Come on in. Can I get you something to drink?" "Just a glass of water, please," I replied, stepping over the threshold. "Are you from the Sutton family over in Sandy Hollow?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "There are quite a few of them in Zacky Hollow." I shook my head. "No, ma'am. As far as I know, my folks are from Louisville, and we're not related to anyone in Sandy Hollow. But I suppose anything's possible." She nodded thoughtfully and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a tall glass of water. As I took a seat at the sturdy wooden table, her two German shepherds stayed close, their sharp eyes fixed on me. The cool water was exactly what I needed, quenching my thirst as a gentle breeze from the fan dried the sweat clinging to my shirt. "My name's Sandra Dresser," she said, setting the glass down. Then, gesturing to the dogs beside her, she added, "And these two are Samson and Delilah." "Nice to meet you," I said with a nod. "I was wondering, do you have anything I could use to fashion a flexible tube? Something like rubber?" I had spotted a row of vintage cars sitting in a nearby field and figured they might hold the spare parts one needed. Sandra smiled. "Oh, don't be shy. Take whatever you need if it'll help you get back on the road." I thanked her and carefully rose from my chair, making sure not to move too quickly around the dogs. Despite my efforts, they remained standing, muscles tense, until Sandra gave a firm command. "Sit." Immediately, both dogs obeyed, lowering themselves onto their haunches. As we stepped outside, I couldn't help but take in Sandra's appearance. She looked to be around 30, her long dark hair tied back in a ponytail beneath a worn-out cap. She wore well-fitted jeans, an old t-shirt, and sturdy work boots, the kind of outfit meant for someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Her bright blue eyes caught the fading sunlight, and for a brief moment, I forgot all about my broken-down truck. Grabbing my tools from the passenger seat, we walked across the pasture toward the rusting collection of old cars parked behind a weathered barn. I rummaged through the pile until I found a flexible steel and rubber hose, along with some clamps to patch up the radiator temporarily. An hour later, my truck was roadworthy again. The sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the yard. Sandra wiped her hands on her jeans and glanced toward the house. "Evening's coming in," she said. "Why don't you clean yourself up and grab a bite to eat before you head back out?" I hesitated, not wanting to impose, but my stomach growled loudly enough to betray me. The aromas drifting from the open window, smoky, rich, and inviting, made the decision for me. That sounds amazing, I admitted. Sandra didn't disappoint. She set the table with a meal that smelled as good as it looked. Perfectly smoked pork chops, creamy mashed potatoes, fragrant collard greens, and spicy black-eyed peas, all served alongside warm, buttery cornbread. And just when I thought I couldn't eat another bite, she brought out a steaming plate of bread pudding and a fresh cup of strong black coffee. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a contented sigh. Sandra, that was the best meal I've had in a long time. That was the best meal I've eaten in years, no kidding, I said, genuinely impressed. Sandra waved off the compliment with a modest shrug. I don't have many guests and I like to cook. Guess you just showed up at the right time. She tossed a few scraps to Samson and Delilah, who had been watching me intently the entire meal. They devoured the food in seconds, then sat back with their tongues hanging out, still keeping a close eye on me. I glanced toward the barn, curiosity getting the better of me. By the way, what's the story with those old cars out back? If you're thinking about selling any of them, I know some folks who might be interested. Sandra followed my gaze, her expression shifting slightly. They actually belong to my ex-husband, she admitted. They've just been sitting there ever since he left. I nodded, sensing there was more to the story. That Fairlane and Ford pickup? You could get a decent price for those if you ever decide to sell. He hasn't been around for 2 years, she said with a sigh. And honestly, I think it's time to do something about it. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she continued. About a year ago, some guy from Knoxville came by, thinking he could swindle me out of them for next to nothing. He must have figured I was gullible, but I sent him packing. Her eyes lit up with amusement at the memory. After dinner, I helped her clear the table, the easy rhythm of working side by side making it feel like we had known each other longer than just a few hours. When everything was cleaned up, I realized the sun had dipped lower, and it was time for me to get back on the road before dark. Even though we had just met, I felt an odd sense of reluctance to leave. There was something about Sandra, her quiet strength, her warmth, that made me want to stick around a little longer. As I grabbed my keys, I hesitated for a moment before saying, Miss Sandra, I have a friend who'd be very interested in that '57 Ford if you ever decide to sell. If you'd like, I'd be happy to put you in touch. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a card. Here's my number. Feel free to call me anytime. She took the card, her fingers brushing against mine briefly. I had a feeling she understood the unspoken invitation, a reason for me to return. But for now the choice was hers. We shook hands, a quiet understanding passing between us. With one last look at the cozy farmhouse, I climbed into my truck and started the engine. As I pulled away, heading back down Hooch Road, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be my last time passing through. The road stretched ahead of me, winding through the Tennessee hills as I drove along Highway 320 toward Pittman Center. But my mind lingered on the evening I had just spent with Sandra Dresser, and the possibility that someday I might just find myself back on her porch again. I couldn't get Sandra out of my mind, the beautiful woman in the white farmhouse. There was something about her, her quiet confidence, the way she carried herself, the warmth in her smile. And the timing of it all struck me. Her ex-husband had walked out 2 years ago, which happened to be the same time I became an ex myself. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to her, like we were both standing at the crossroads of past heartbreak and whatever came next. Most days my mind drifted back to my own past. It wasn't all bad, but it sure wasn't all good either. The memories had a way of creeping in when I least expected them, especially when the wrong people reminded me of the life I had tried to move on from. Back then June and I didn't have kids yet. She had been balancing classes at the local community college while working shifts at a barbecue cafe, and I was constantly on the move, running deliveries, taking orders, sometimes even staying overnight in Tennessee for work. It was a fast-paced life, but we made it work. Eventually, she finished school and landed a job as a shift nurse at the county hospital. Around the same time, I was promoted to regional manager, though the long hours didn't change much. I was still on the road, still making daily trips. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was young and I was naive. One night, we were out at a bar with some friends when a slow song started playing. Before I knew it, Terry, a woman I barely knew, had pulled me onto the dance floor. She pressed close, the scent of her perfume intoxicating, her voice low as she teased, "Jesus, what are you thinking about?" I swallowed hard. "Nothing you don't already know," I muttered, trying to keep some distance between us. Terry gave me a knowing smile, and for a split second I felt the pull of temptation. Any man would have. She was beautiful, the kind of woman who knew exactly what she was doing. But I was married. I had made a promise and I intended to keep it. "Terry, I'm a devoted man," I said firmly. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, but then she smirked. "Oh, I know. You're one of the good ones, huh?" Before I could respond, June appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm, leading me away from the dance floor. She wasn't the jealous type, but she had a way of stepping in before things could go too far. "I'm not letting this happen," I told her as we walked. She chuckled, shaking her head. "Relax, big boy. You think every man believes he's got a shot at the impossible?" Her confidence was something I had always admired. She knew exactly where she stood, and she was right. Terry never had a chance. No one did. The night wore on, and as midnight approached, we decided to call it. Most of our friends had been drinking heavily, laughing at things that weren't all that funny, their filters long gone. That's when I heard it. "It's not fair that she has two and we don't have one," one of the girls slurred, giggling. At first, I brushed it off as drunken nonsense. But then Terry's expression changed. She realized what had been said, what it implied. And in that moment, so did I. I turned to her, my voice casual but sharp. "Who else has won that big, Charlie?" The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken truths. The meaning hit me like a freight train. And just like that, the past I had spent years trying to forget came rushing back. Tuesdays and Wednesdays had always been my nights at home. June had Tuesdays off, which gave her the perfect opportunity to do whatever she pleased without worrying about getting caught. I never suspected a thing, until fate decided to intervene. One Tuesday evening, instead of staying overnight in Seville, Tennessee as I usually did for work, I made a last-minute decision to head back to Waynesville. I picked up a bag of barbecue and a few drinks, figuring I'd catch the game from the small upper field next to our house. I rolled in around 11 that night, expecting to see our home as I had left it. But something was off. June's car was gone. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she ran out for something. Maybe she was at her sister's. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't settle. And when she came home earlier than usual the following week, looking nervous, my suspicions solidified into something worse. I had to know the truth. The next Tuesday I waited. This time I didn't just drive home, I took action. I crossed the street to where his car was parked, crouched down and flattened all four of his tires. Then, just for good measure, I did the same to one of June's. If she was going to betray me, she wasn't going to do it without consequence. Afterward, I made my way to the back of the house. The bedroom window was open, letting in the cool night air. The porch light was already on. I moved quietly, slipping in through the back door without a sound. I pulled out my phone, hit the record button, and made my way down the hall. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady as I pushed the bedroom door open and flicked on the light. The look on their faces said it all. Guilt. Panic. I had imagined this moment in my head a dozen times over the last week, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let myself break down. Not yet. I turned on my heel, walked out of the house, and climbed into my truck. My mind was racing, emotions threatening to take over, but I forced myself to focus. I had work to do. Pulling around to the barn, I grabbed the old hitch I kept for hauling cargo and hooked it up. Then I walked back to where his car sat, lifeless on its ruined tires, and hitched it up. Without hesitation, I started driving. About 1.5 miles down the road, I passed him, walking, stranded, watching helplessly as his car, tires flattened, trailed behind my truck like some kind of twisted trophy. I didn't stop. By the time I reached Waynesville, I found a parking lot, unhitched the car, and left it there for him to deal with. Then I drove home. It should have been the end of it. I should have walked away for good. But June? She didn't let go so easily. She started showing up at the restaurant where I worked, slipping onto the bar stool beside me like nothing had changed. Her sister started dropping by more often, bringing food, striking up casual conversations, acting like things hadn't fallen apart. Like I could just forget. But some betrayals don't fade with time. Some stay with you, no matter how much distance you try to put between yourself and the past. I had a suspicion that June still had some lingering feelings for me, or at the very least, that she wasn't ready to fully let go. But if there was one thing I had learned, it was that I needed to put an end to the games once and for all. So, I came up with a plan. I reached out to Terry and invited her to the club over on Patton for a Friday night out. To my surprise, she not only agreed, but she also suggested spending the whole weekend at my place. I wasn't expecting that, but I wasn't about to turn her down either. If June wanted to make a fool out of me, maybe it was time to give her a taste of her own medicine. By Sunday evening, I found myself in a familiar place, the same bar where June and her new boyfriend liked to hang out. This time, I wasn't interested in hiding my intentions. As I walked up to her, I leaned in slightly and lowered my voice. "Listen carefully, June. I said, my tone calm but sharp. I don't care that you've got that guy living in your house. You've been with him long enough, might as well keep things going. I let a smirk tug at the corner of my lips before adding, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that I had a great time with your friend Terry last weekend. Her reaction was immediate. June's eyes widened before she suddenly recoiled, her hand flying across my face in a hard slap. A moment later, her expression crumbled and she burst into tears. Her boyfriend, who had been sitting at the table, shot to his feet, his muscles tensing as if he was about to make a move. But the moment I straightened up and gave him a pointed look, he hesitated. He must have thought better of it because he sank back down, muttering something under his breath. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had regained control of the situation. But instead of feeling satisfied, I just felt done. Deep down, I knew this back and forth wasn't what I wanted. That moment of confrontation may have given me the upper hand, but it wasn't the life I wanted to keep living. I needed a change, something bigger than this petty back and forth. And that's when I made my decision. I had always loved the mountains. Something about the endless roads cutting through the hills, the way the trees changed with the seasons, it gave me a peace that I had never found anywhere else. So instead of sticking to my usual route through Murphy or taking the I-40 entrance into Tennessee, I decided to go a different way. I took the long way around Sakuch Road through the mountains. It added a little time to my drive, but in good weather, the scenic route was worth every extra mile. I even pulled off at a small stream, watching the water rush past as fishermen cast their lines on both sides of the bridge. I considered stopping to join them, but I had places to be. As I neared my destination, I caught sight of something familiar, Miss Sandra's house. She was standing outside, deep in conversation with a man, her two dogs sitting beside her, watching her every move like silent sentries. I couldn't quite make out the details, but she seemed animated, smiling as she spoke. I slowed down slightly, lingering just long enough to take in the scene before pressing on. Sandra was an interesting woman. A quiet strength about her, a kind of self-assuredness that I admired. She didn't need saving. She had built something for herself, piece by piece, and it showed. I remembered what she had told me about those old cars, the ones her ex-husband had left behind. It was a valuable hiding place, especially if she could get a fair price for them. I had mentioned before that I knew someone who would pay good money for that '57 Ford. Maybe it was time to follow up on that offer. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop looking back and start looking forward instead. I'd say in its current state, you could get anywhere from $8,800 to $10,000 for it, I told Sandra, gauging the value of the '57 Ford. Let them know I'm interested, she replied without hesitation. We went over a few more details before I decided to reach out to a contact of mine in Seville who specialized in selling vintage cars. I figured if anyone could get her a fair price, it would be him. As we chatted, Sandra brought up her ex-husband again. He had some pretty delusional ideas, kind of like your wife, she said with a smirk. I used to call him Pinocchio because of all the lies he told. Seemed fitting. I chuckled at that. That's probably the best nickname you could have given him. Do you know Bill Dresser? She asked suddenly. He's from the south side of Hazelwood, over in Balham. Not too far from where you are now. I shook my head. Can't say I do. Well, according to my father, Bill was in love with Cosby's girlfriend. Thought she was something special, but turns out she wasn't as interesting as he imagined, she said with a small laugh. They were involved a few times, but he neglected to mention he was married at the time. Sandra didn't seem the least bit bothered by the story. In fact, she kept smiling, her confidence shining through. Honestly, getting rid of that jerk was the best decision I ever made, she admitted, leaning back in her chair. The more we talked, the more I learned about her life after the divorce. She had adjusted well, better than most. She worked as a midwife in East Tennessee, mostly in the foothills, delivering babies and helping families through some of the most important moments of their lives. The farm she lived on had been in her family for generations, passed down from her grandmother. Before the divorce, she had grown tobacco on a small 3-acre plot, but after her ex left, she shifted her focus to maintaining the land on her own. There was a quiet strength about Sandra. She had built something for herself, piece by piece, and she wasn't looking back. At some point, I found myself at a buffet table, reluctantly joining in on what felt like a silent competition to see who could pile the most food onto their plate. As we sat down to eat, the energy around the table was strangely familiar, almost like stepping back in time. Isn't this great? Sandra's mother said with a big smile. Just like the old days. I glanced across the table at June, who for the first time in a long while actually looked happy. We found a spot near the pool tables where the girls were playing, and as we talked, I learned that the old band still got together on weekends. Even June had been joining in lately. Terry, on the other hand, stayed quiet about her ex's whereabouts. I didn't press, it wasn't my business, but the longer we sat there talking, the more I realized how much had changed, and how much still felt the same. I realized then that I wanted to spend the evening with Sandra. There was an undeniable pull between us, something I hadn't felt in a long time. We ended up back at my house, where conversation turned into something more, and eventually we drifted off to sleep, tangled in the warmth of the moment. A few hours later, I woke to the unmistakable sound of my mother's voice. "Josh, I don't know what kind of household you're running here, but allowing tramps to come and go at any time is unacceptable," she declared. I blinked, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. My father stood nearby, wisely staying silent, clearly deciding this wasn't his battle to fight. I glanced over at June, then back at my mother, my patience wearing thin. "Mom," I said, leveling my gaze at her. "How old am I?" "You're 30, she answered, folding her arms. "And how long have I been living on my own?" "Since you turned 19, I think." "That's right," I confirmed. "Since I was 19. Which means I don't need a lecture about who I invite into my house." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck before glancing at the three of them. June, my mother, and my father all stood there, each with their own unreadable expression. The tension in the room was thick, but I wasn't about to entertain any more of this conversation. I grinned and changed the subject. "Does anyone want a beer?" "June, you too." My parents exchanged looks but ultimately accepted. My father pulled some cold chicken from the fridge while I grabbed the drinks. After a while, I pulled June aside and took her to my workshop, wanting to make something clear. "There's no reason for you to come into my house and criticize the people I spend time with," I said firmly. "None at all. I know you're having fun with someone else right now and that's your choice. But if that's acceptable for you, then you have no right to judge me for moving on." She didn't argue, and for the first time in a long time, it seemed like my words actually resonated with her. "I get it," she admitted after a long pause. "I think it's time I moved on too." I nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. I appreciate your support," she added, though her voice was softer now. "I'll always have feelings for you, but I know I can't undo the past. And I won't ask you to forgive me." I didn't respond, just gave a small nod. We continued talking until she had to leave, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real goodbye, not just another chapter in our back and forth. Later that day I found myself somewhere unexpected. Sandra and I had taken a walk down to a quiet pond, where the water was clear and cool from the mountain stream that fed into it. She climbed up onto a low-hanging branch, flashing me a mischievous grin before diving in headfirst, breaking the surface with a splash. She emerged laughing, her dark hair slicked back, droplets clinging to her skin as she treaded water. I hesitated for a moment, watching her, weighing the moment in my mind. But then, with a shrug, I kicked off my boots and pulled my shirt over my head. Before I could think too much about it, I stripped down and followed her into the water, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't looking back. I was just here. With her. I followed Sandra's lead, diving into the pond and sinking beneath the cool water before surfacing up to my shoulders. The evening air felt crisp against my skin, and as I wiped the water from my face, I saw her standing beside me, her face glowing with pure happiness. This place stirred something deep inside me, memories of childhood summers spent here back when my grandmother still lived on this land. I could almost see my younger self splashing around in this very pond, cooling off on hot afternoons. It was strange how life had led me back here, full circle, in a way I never expected. As we made our way back to the house, Sandra turned to me with a warm, encouraging smile. "I've got the guest room ready for you," she said. "Enjoy a hearty breakfast in the morning and leave when you're ready." The offer was too tempting to resist. Something about being here, about being with her, felt right. So I canceled my hotel reservation and spent the night in her guest room. The next morning she sent me off to work with a plate of fresh eggs, crispy bacon, homemade biscuits, and strong black coffee, the kind of rustic breakfast that stuck with you all day. By Saturday afternoon, we had made plans for an actual date. That evening we headed to Gatlinburg for dinner and a quiet night at a charming bed and breakfast tucked away in the village. For the first time in years I felt like I wasn't just going through the motions, I was actually living. But the past has a way of creeping up when you least expect it. At the restaurant, familiar faces filled the room. Old acquaintances from town, colleagues from the hospital where Sandra used to work. And, of course, Terry and June. Terry was across the room, laughing with a group of old friends. June, on the other hand, seemed occupied with a man I didn't recognize. It was clear she was trying to move on, and yet, when she caught sight of me with Sandra, she still made the effort to approach. She offered a small, hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she murmured, "for how everything turned out." I nodded, acknowledging the words, but they didn't stir much in me anymore. My parents still treated her like family, which once might have bothered me, but now, it barely touched me at all. The evening should have ended there, but as Sandra and I were preparing to leave, June approached us again. Sandra remained patient, explaining who she was with quiet confidence. But when she mentioned the man beside her, something in June shifted. Her eyes welled up with tears, and I realized something I hadn't before. He had been her traveling companion. Now she was stranded without a car. Sandra and I exchanged a glance before deciding to take her to her sister Anne's house. It wasn't something I would have expected to do, but in that moment, it felt like the right thing. As we stepped outside and made our way to the parking lot, June lingered behind for a moment to say goodbye to someone. Sandra and I continued ahead, but then, just as I was opening the truck door, I heard quick footsteps approaching. June was following us, and something about the way she was moving made my gut tighten with unease. A bright flash erupted in front of me, followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. Instinct took over. I dropped down fast, my heart hammering in my chest. Everything after that blurred into chaos. By the time the dust settled, June was the one lying on the ground, bleeding. The next few hours were a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights, and hushed voices in hospital corridors. She was rushed into surgery, and I was left pacing, waiting for news. June was now in the intensive care unit, kept in an artificial coma to allow her body to heal. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. She would survive, but the full extent of her injuries wouldn't be clear until she woke up. One of the surgeons explained the situation in a careful, clinical tone. The bullet shattered on impact. Some fragments grazed the medial temporal lobe, which could affect aspects of her memory. Fortunately, it doesn't appear to have impacted her motor functions. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "We'll know more in the coming days." I listened, nodding numbly, but my mind was elsewhere. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I was still legally her spouse, but my heart had already moved on. In my dresser, tucked away in a small box, was a wedding ring, one I had been holding onto for the right moment. I had planned to propose to Sandra in just a few days. And now, everything had changed. When June finally woke up, I was at her bedside. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and uncertain, as she looked around. "June," I said softly, leaning in, "do you know what date it is? Or what year?" She blinked, confused, her voice hoarse. "July. Maybe 2012? My stomach clenched. She had lost nearly a decade. I turned to the doctor, who met my gaze but avoided any definite answers. He had warned me this might happen. Memories scrambled, lost somewhere in the past. Sandra stood quietly by the door, her expression unreadable, tears welling in her eyes. I reached for June's hand, steady but careful. "Don't worry about anything right now. Just focus on getting better." In the following weeks, I did my best to help her adjust, but I was walking a tightrope. June was stuck in the past, back when we were still together before everything had fallen apart. And the hardest part? She had no memory of her affair, her betrayal, or the years that followed. Sandra gave me space to figure it out, but I could feel the weight of the situation pressing on us both. A year passed. Bill Dresser, the man responsible for June's injury, was convicted after our confrontation in Asheville, and with that chapter closed, I made a decision. I sold my house in Louisville and took a position at the regional office, a fresh start in more ways than one. Sandra and I still spent time together, but there was an unspoken hesitation between us. A part of her, I knew, was waiting to see how I would handle the situation with June. And June? She knew. She could see it even if she didn't want to admit it. I once wondered how I would feel if someone I loved disappeared from my life, only to return years later and marry someone else. I thought maybe I'd understand June's pain now, seeing her wrestle with the reality of the situation. She looked at me one evening, her voice quiet but steady. "I know you love her." I didn't deny it. "And I know," she continued, swallowing hard, "that I did this to myself." There was no anger in her tone, just a painful acceptance of the choices that had led us here. She acknowledged it. "And for the first time, so did I."